This is Michael Matheson Miller, and you are listening to the Moral Imagination Podcast. So welcome, everyone, to the Moral Imagination. My name is Michael Matheson Miller. Thank you for joining us today. My guest today, I'm very happy to have Dr. Bradley Birzer. Dr. Birzer graduated from the University of Notre Dame, and we actually were there at the same time with Jim Otteson, who the first podcast I did with Jim Otteson. And we met, actually, I met you and Jim at this kind of now famous Liberty Fund conference about Burke and Paine. And we all discovered we were at Notre Dame at the same time. And you and Jim were good friends, but I unfortunately didn't know either of you. So it was a great disappointment. But I'm glad I know you now. That's what I told Jim. So I'm really happy to have Brad on the show. Brad, thank you for joining.
Oh, it's great, Michael. Thanks for having me. And I remember we used to eat at the same time at the North Dining Hall. So we definitely crossed paths.
That's right. I used to tell people that my name was Mike North and that my dad had donated the dining hall.
Yeah, you would be. That's great.
So, I mean, there was also a South Dining Hall, but anyway.
Yes.
So Brad is a history professor at Hillsdale College. He's the Russell Amos Kirk Chair in American Studies. Also the author of many books on J.R.R. Tolkien, Christopher Dawson, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, a very important biography of Russell Kirk, also a biography of the rock star Neil Peart. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Peart.
That's right.
Yep.
Yeah, and is working on a book on Robert Nisbet. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about Robert Nisbet and his work and his ideas. So Brad, really thanks a lot for being here. Good. So why don't we start? What I'd like to do is maybe just like for people who don't know anything about Nisbet, let's start with like one or two of his big ideas, and then we'll go into his bio, and then we'll start to kind of talk through some of those ideas and why Nisbet's important. So why don't we start with like why Robert Nisbet is an American sociologist and really a disciple of Tocqueville and Burke, but also other 19th century thinkers. Right. Okay, why don't you say tell me a little bit about Robert Nisbet. What are some of his big ideas and why you think he's important today?
Yeah. So again, thank you, Michael, so much for having me on. So Nisbet was born in 1913 and he passed away in 1996. So very much a 20th century figure. And one of the interesting things about him, and in some ways it's just a temporal accident, but he and Russell Kirk really had great success with their first major books in 1953, both Nisbet's Quest for Community and Russell Kirk's The Conservative Mind came out at roughly the same time. So Nisbet's book came out in February of 1953, and Kirk's book came out in March of 1953. And there were other books that came out that year as well. There were Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451 and Strauss's book on history and natural right. So it was a really kind of a banner year for conservative publications. So there's just that kind of weird accident that 1953 is this year of miracle for conservatives. And Nisbet was really, even though, and you identified him absolutely correctly, Michael, that he was an American sociologist, he really thought of himself more as a historian of intellectual thought. And he saw himself as a historian of sociology as much as he did a sociologist. So right. There's a lot of diversity to this guy. And we also find that in the 1950s and 60s that he was as popular among conservatives as he was among the left. There was a whole contingent of the left, especially the new leftists, not the old left, but the new left, that really bought into Quest for Community as kind of a cult book. And that's fascinating in and of itself. But you ask about his ideas, and this is a man who's just brimming with ideas. He's so enthusiastic and he wants to explain his ideas. But I think two of the ideas that he thought were most important were, number one, his idea of what he considered developmentalism, this idea that there was almost a change in consciousness in the way human history developed throughout kind of the whole course, at least of Western civilization. He didn't do as much with Hindu and Buddhist and Confucius civilization, but within the Judeo-Christian civilization, that there had been this kind of development of ideas over time, what he just called developmentalism. And then we also have his idea, his other big idea that is very de Tocquevillian and very Burkean, and that is that the modern state is really not a state at all. It's a church and a corporation. So when we look at something like Romans 13, which of course is such a huge thing for Acton and people involved with modern Christianity, Nisbet basically argued, well, what was being talked about by Paul in Romans 13 is not what is in existence now, that the state, through the element of propaganda and through the element of its own bureaucratic mechanism, has become essentially the church. And it's not at all what people talked about state, at least in, say, the Middle Ages or even in the early modern period, though they were moving towards that in some way. So those are two of his big ideas. I think there are a lot of others that we could talk about, but those two were really important, I think.
Great. No, I think that's really important. I think that the development question, and one of the things I thought is interesting, and you brought out the fact that he's a sociologist, but also an intellectual historian.
Right.
And I think one thing that I like about Nisbet, of course I have confirmation bias here, but that Nisbet takes seriously ideas. And so a lot of times in sociology, that's why I think his sociology is really valuable, because a lot of sociologists are kind of focused on certain movements or data. And he also takes seriously the ideas, these concepts that change consciousness, as you brought up. So I think that's why I think his one of the things when I've talked about him before is that he challenges us, I think, to think sociologically, to think in institutions and to think in ideas. And so in one sense, he challenges the sociological mind, which can oftentimes focus on data, or he focuses on the philosophical mind, and he combines them. And I find that both refreshing, but also important. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with you completely. And I think it's one of the things that when we look at him, it makes him different than someone like Kirk, right? And I love Russell Kirk. Absolutely love Russell Kirk. But
well, how long is the book that you wrote on Kirk? It's 500 pages.
Not long enough. But what's interesting about Kirk is everything is poetic for him. Everything. Mm-hmm. And you kind of miss, there are some things in the social sciences, the materialist aspects that Kirk just doesn't deal with, and he doesn't want to deal with, and he admits he's not dealing with them. And I think someone like Nisbet was much more like Christopher Dawson in this way, in that he's willing to say, of course, ideas matter, absolutely, but if we're not looking at what's going on in the material world, we're also missing a huge part of reality as well. So he could be very critical of the social sciences, but he also recognized that when properly employed, they have their place. Whereas Kirk just said, no social sciences, right? They're just wrong in every way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a value. So the other thing that's interesting is on the modern state. There's a quote I'm trying to remember. It's Joseph Ratzinger actually compares Romans 13 and Revelation 13, and he says when the state acts as if it's this totalitarian force that is really the arbiter of truth and justice, it acts like the beast from the abyss.
I did not know that. That's great.
Yeah, so. If you think about it, we're talking about kind of Revelation, the beast from the abyss, and you're like, well, who said that? Well, it's actually Joseph Ratzinger, right? It's not like a television preacher. This is the most serious theologian of our day, right? And this is. So anyway, it's interesting that you brought up Romans 13, and that he says, that Nisbet says this is not the model of the state that we're thinking about. So I want to actually take some time to go into what is the modern state. And
Michael, I bring that up too, partly I'm in a Facebook group called Christian Anarchy, that it isn't as radical as it sounds. It's really just kind of, it deals with this question of Romans 13 all the time. Scott Backey runs it. And we have these discussions, and that Ratzinger thing is going to be great. I'll give you credit for that, but I definitely am going to post that sometime.
I will send you the quote today. Yeah, I'm looking for the exact quote here. But anyway, I'll see. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the modern state and go through it, especially like Rousseau and et cetera. But let me say another thing that I think was interesting. Maybe we've talked about this before, but I know I've talked about this on the Moral Imagination show and everything, that there's an interesting relationship between people like Nisbet and Burke and Tocqueville and localism. And what you find, you find people like Burke and Nisbet influencing a certain left localism, like the hippie movements,
Right.
and this kind of this movement here. And actually, Ratzinger, by the way, he writes about that as well. That there's this, even though Ratzinger is deeply critical of 1968, as am I, right? I was born in 1969, so just after my goal is to take revenge on 1968.
Well, I was 67, so
you're partially corrupted. But anyway, so I think there is something about this localist movement, and I think so. I'd like to go into this in more detail, but I think Nisbet, Burke, Tocqueville, the breaking away from the modern state and the rebuilding of community also seems to me another element. So this is actually maybe a question or comment. Like, it seems like if one is development and change in consciousness, and two is the modern state, maybe his third idea, would you say this is correct, is that the response to the modern state has to be a reinvigoration of communities, or what he calls a new laissez-faire, not an economic laissez-faire,
right,
but a civil laissez-faire. Do you think that's fair?
I think that is so fair. And it fits so nicely, too, within the American tradition. When you think about not only the Declaration, but the whole idea of the Northwest Ordinance and making sure that we have these associations. And you think about the First Amendment, right? We have the right not just to the religion to be not interfered with by Congress, but we have the right to petition and assemble. And those are all very Nisbetian themes, I think, without question.
So maybe let's talk a little bit about his bio right now. And then I do want to actually talk about one thing. So I'm going to put it out here now so I don't forget it.
Sure.
But I think one thing that's interesting is a growing number of conservatives today are very critical of the American founding. And Nisbet, and you seem to write this in your essay on Leviathan, Inc., which I love that title. Where
it's a very Michael title.
Well, it's we're second, third hand dealers in ideas. Okay, so but that Nisbet, in a sense, thinks that 20th century liberalism is a departure, and so I'd like to at one point talk about the American founding in relationship. But before, so I'm going to kind of postpone that, but I do want to at least ask one question is, where do you place Robert Nisbet? You know, you've talked about a conservative with Burke and other place, but where do you place him kind of broadly? When you say a conservative thinker, a lot of people may think one thing. What do you mean by Nisbet as a conservative thinker?
Well, he's conservative in the sense that he is trying to conserve the best of Western civilization. And he's very open about that in his discussion of the great books and the great ideas. But he also, one of the interesting things, and this is where I think he differs from at least the way Kirk presented himself. Kirk, of course, was always conservative in the sense that he too was trying to preserve, but he also believed that there was something in conservatism itself that for the modern day was such an article of prudence in the way that we judge the past. Nisbet had that, but Nisbet had a more radical streak as well. Yeah, Nisbet speaks very, very fondly of the anti-socialist anarchists. He writes of them repeatedly in ways by calling them brilliant and insightful. And he loves, and I apologize, I can't pronounce his name properly, but Proudhon, I think. Proudhon, right?
But if you say it, like if you start with like a Proudhon, it totally counts. So don't worry about it.
I have never been good at any Romance language. And I always want to give it a German kind of guttural. Yeah. But anyway, the way that he talks about him, you know, he quotes him all the time, and especially let your associations multiply and you will be free. Right. It's the essence of 19th century anarchism, not anarchism in the sense of, assassinating presidents and throwing bombs.
Or socialism, which a lot of anarchism is just kind of socialism.
Exactly. But, that word is so tainted. I can just imagine telling my mother, I've been studying the anarchists. She would be very worried, very worried, and understandably so. But it's a different kind of anarchism, right? That idea of how do we really understand civil society? So Nisbet, he actually wrote, because he was so involved with the neocons, he wrote a lot about the American founding during the American bicentennial. And I have, that's a literature of Nisbet that I still need to read more carefully. I am no expert on that at all. I've read through it, but he was very fond of the founding and certainly had a kind of de Tocquevillian view of it. I think.
Okay, good. Well, maybe we can do another one on that. Another episode on that. I think could be interesting to think about the American founding. There's a lot of debate on the American founding right now.
Yeah.
So, I talk about this. I was talking to Sam Gregg about this. So my daughter says, "What are you, Dad?" And I say, "I'm a Burkean associationalist."
Ooh, I like it.
Right. So I'm the only one, but if you want to join in, there's going to be two.
I like it.
But I think that's partially what anarchy, I think, that Nisbet's getting to, right? That it's not, anarchy is associationalism, and it comes to a really important theme in Nisbet, which we are going to talk about, which is his understanding of authority, and that there should be multiple centers of authority in society, and that one of his deep critiques, would you say, of the modern state is that it removes all other types of authority except the state. So there's this little tiny individual and this big Leviathan state and nothing in between. And part of Nisbet's anarchy, do you think it's fair to say, is that there should be a multiplication of associations?
Yes, absolutely. And of course, in the way he presents that, this is where community is so powerful, right? We have all of us, every human being, except for a sociopath, right? I mean, there are always going to be exceptions, but for the normal human being, we always desire to be in community. And if it's not that organic kind of common law community that we see in the English tradition, which de Tocqueville admired so much, if it's not that, it'll be something else. And so we'll put our community in the communists or in the Nazis or the fascists, the nationalists, right, in some way. So that nation state provides a form of community, but it's a dangerous form of community, right, as Nisbet sees it.
Great. Okay, so I think that's right. So let's do this. I think that's a pretty good introduction to some of his big themes. Let's pause now and talk a little bit about Robert Nisbet. You said he was born in 1913. He was born in California. He grew up in Maricopa, and he said it was a place. How do you say it? Hostile to the human spirit.
Right, except for the library.
Right, except for the library. So he said it was the library that saved him, and and so I think we benefit from the fact that there was a good library, because one of the things I have to say when I read Nisbet and reading different people, I mean, he's super impressive. I mean, Brad, what do you think? I just read him golly, this guy. Yeah. I mean, even I disagree with him on certain things. I assume you do too, and I think he's got some incoherent positions here and there, But when you read him, you think, this man is a scholar. I mean, he's the real deal. He is truly
a scholar. He brings his brain and his soul to everything that he does. He's an exemplar of Stoic excellence, right? In the way that he comes to things. There's no way that he'll approach a topic without bringing his entire being to it and giving everything he has. You can read it in every sentence he writes, even when he's got a clunker here or there. He's not a beautiful prose writer, but
it's clear, super clear.
You can feel it. It is clear and it is earnest. You can feel his conviction, his integrity in every sentence, and I love that. And he talks about that he was a transplanted Southerner. He loved Robert E. Lee. He loved Stonewall Jackson. He grew up on those stories, but he grew up in California, and he grew up in a pretty intellectual household where his parents encouraged the discussion of ideas. His mom was a Christian Scientist. His dad was a Presbyterian. He himself was really nothing, though I think he always admired religion, and he admired the faith. He admired Roman Catholicism and Judaism. I think without question he admired those, but couldn't bring himself to them. But he still carries, and that's why I think there's a Stoic conviction there in the way that he approaches things.
Yeah, that's really good. So why don't you tell us just a little bit about his life? So he went to Berkeley, and why don't you go develop a little bit of that?
He's kind of a quintessential academic. He goes to Berkeley, gets all of his degrees at Berkeley, his BA, his MA, his PhD. He earns them all between about 1936 and 1940. Right, gets his PhD in 1939 and really is it's secured in 1940. He teaches then at Berkeley from 1940 until 1953. And then, of course, they create this new college, University of California at Riverside, in which he is made the Dean of Arts and Sciences. And he goes out, and it's at the same time that he goes there that he publishes his Quest for Community. And I think this is a guy who would have been very happy being a quiet but sincere academic most of his life. But that book, Quest for Community, really thrust him into the limelight. And once he becomes a part of the public spotlight, he never really lets go. So he continues to do his job as dean at Riverside all through the 1950s. He has these visiting positions at various prestigious places. He's given the Great Award of Italy, right, the Great Citizen Medal, the Medal of the Republic, while he teaches there. One of the things I came across, Michael, this isn't quite what you're asking, but I love this. I did a search. One of my databases that I keep and I have for years. It helped me with the Kirk book. It helped me with all kinds of things. I belong to newspaperarchive.com. And you can find the weirdest stuff. But one of the things I found was when he came back from his year in Italy, Berkeley actually had a little parade for him. I mean, there were people with big placards waiting for the Nisbets to come back. And, it was weird stuff that he was that popular.
Yeah.
But, so he does his job. He's beloved there. And then in the 1960s, he really kicks it into high gear when it comes to writing in a public way. And so he has this it's a decade really, where he just kind of allows the ideas to percolate after he's become this public intellectual. And then once he becomes involved in the early 1960s, he never stops. Yeah, he is involved in public debates all the way until his death in 1996. And he's a major player, no question about that. But he's always quiet about it. It's not, let me show off and let me be a public figure. It's more, this is what has been thrust upon me, and I'm going to do it to the best of my abilities.
Mm-hmm.
That's what
that's good. That's interesting. Well, I love that. So I didn't know that stuff about the parade. That's hilarious.
Can you imagine? You fly back in town and everybody's waiting with placards for you at the airport.
I mean, my family does that sometimes. But.
Yes, but not all of Grand Rapids shows up, unfortunately.
They're wise. So what? That's great. Maybe talk a little bit about some of his intellectual influences. So he studied under Frederick Taggart, and then he kind of talks about how I liked, and you talked about this in your essay in Leviathan, and he talks about in some of his kind of autobiographies, just how he came from a supporter of the New Deal. Here he was, kind of a supporter of the New Deal. And next thing you know, he's this like virulent anti-statist. Could you talk a little bit how that developed and some of the main influences there? Yeah,
well, I think part of it is just growing up with Franklin Roosevelt. And you can imagine, in 1933, things are so dire. It's not, in many ways, it's not that different of a situation than what we're in right now. When you consider what's going on with unemployment, and we're allowing the governor to do all kinds of things. I mean, she's got incredible power here in Michigan right now. And that's not just here, that's in many of the states. And, you think, okay, well, we're in the middle of a crisis, and maybe we're not quite as critical as we would be in a normal time period because we're in a period of crisis. And I think that's kind of Nisbet. He grew up with that, thinking, we got to do something has to be done. And then he reads, at least as far as we know, he reads Our Enemy, the State by Albert J. Nock, and he becomes absolutely convinced that Roosevelt is like the worst thing ever for America. And he really changes his view on this. And then he reads Rousseau, and he's looking at a lot. I think there's something in him, and I haven't quite explored this as much as I'd like in the book. I'm going to try and do this a lot more, Michael. But I think there's a whole history of the American West, of the frontier, that Roosevelt was heavily influenced by. Frederick Jackson Turner writes this essay in 1893 about, with the frontier closed, we no longer have access to resources like we did. We can't be the kind of free-willing capitalists that we were. And one of his students is Franklin Roosevelt at Harvard. And it's no accident that when Roosevelt becomes president, his whole thing, we call him a progressive, but in many ways he's a regressive, because what he sees is there are no new resources. And he's got that Frederick Jackson Turner take, and there are no new resources. And therefore we have to manage everything that we have now. And that's a huge argument within American West and the idea of the frontier. And I think Nisbet comes out of that same tradition, because Taggart had not only been a sociologist and a philosopher, he'd been a historian of the American West. This is a guy out in California, and he's taking a different view of frontiers than did Turner and Roosevelt. And so I think there are a lot of things going on for Nisbet in the 1930s. A lot of things come together for him, not just his studying with Taggart, this kind of Western guy, this almost cowboyish figure in a lot of ways, but I think his reaction to Roosevelt and a different kind of theory as well. So I can tell just by explaining it to you, Michael, I'm still a little rough on this, but I think it's an interesting theme that needs to be explored.
Yeah. No, super interesting. Maybe just develop it a little bit. That's interesting part, because that part I think is I don't know that Western influence at all. Explain that a little bit about the idea of the West and these two concepts of resources, because here's why I think it's important. One, I think it's intellectually important, but two, because there's a similar debate right now, right? Between how are all of our resources running out, not just natural resources, but even we've seen most of the growth in the economy. Robert Gordon has a theory on this that I think Peter Thiel also, I think, subscribes to a bit. We're saying, look, we haven't really seen much development outside of digital technology. So outside of kind of computers, and that's important, but outside of that, we haven't seen as much development. And people like Thiel are saying, so what we really need is more innovation. We need 0 to 1. People like Jaron Lanier write about this in a little bit of a different way, but they say, look, unfortunately, a lot of the developments that we got ended up going to behavior modification, and to a lot of kind of negative social things. And what we need to do is really have new technological development. And so there's kind of a lot of different overlapping strands here, which would take some time to develop. But I think there's this debate that either, the good days are over, and now we got to just manage what we have. And that encourages more managerial capitalism and more of the state being involved. And then there's a sense, the good days are over, but they don't have to be over if we do things in a new way. And then there's another sense, which is the good days aren't over, I guess.
Right.
I don't know. Maybe, I don't know. But I think that's obviously a very nuanced, just kind of description. But I think it's something related to what you were bringing out with the West. How do we understand what the future of America looks like? I mean, a lot of people are starting to worry right now that we have a promise. Like Eric Weinstein talks about this a bit, where he says we have an assumption that we're going to have continuous growth and that every generation is going to be better off than their parents. And that's starting to change. And there's a lot of fear about it. And it seems to me, if I understood you correctly, that there's a similar thing going on between Frederick Jackson Turner's theory of the West and Nisbet's response to that. Did I misunderstand that, or what do you think?
Not at all. And I'd recommend, there's a book in the early 90s by a really good scholar called, his name's David Robel. It's Wrobel, and I can't remember the name of the book right now, but it's all about.
I'll find it, and I'll put it on the.
It's
page.
Maybe 91 or 92, but it's a book about how much Franklin Roosevelt was influenced by Turner's thesis. And so what we have is this, the James Burnham kind of idea of the managerialism, that we only manage what we have. And you can imagine, you think about something, even like the Democratic Party, when you juxtapose in 1932, Franklin Roosevelt saying it's all over and we just manage it, versus 1959 or 1960 with John F. Kennedy saying, oh, no, it's all just beginning. This is the new frontier. You have both Democrats, but radically different one from another. And that's part of what Robel is getting at, this image of how we view. So if we view the frontier in kind of John Wayne terms, and we've got this noble story and we go out and we conquer the wilderness and we take those resources and we're innovative with them and we become one with the Indian, even as we're challenging the Indian and we're developing all these things, we've got a pretty optimistic view about what America is. And you think about the prevalence of the Westerns in the 1940s and 50s, right? And that story is always the same. It's America conquering and, through great adversity coming out on top. But then you look at it from a Turnerian perspective, from the point of view of Frederick Jackson Turner, and that's all over, because by 1890, there's no frontier left anymore. We've conquered it. And yet we have this spirit as Americans that we always need to expand and we need to use the resources and we're not being good stewards of the earth. And that's the kind of thing that Franklin Roosevelt inherits. And I think Nisbet had a healthy sense that, sure, we could overexploit the environment, right? This is a guy who would go on 3-day, 4-day backpacking trips in the Sierras. He's an outdoor guy. He was in the army in World War II. Yeah, he served at Saipan, of all places, one of the most brutal, bloodiest battles of the whole Pacific theater. Nisbet is there. Never wrote about it, never talked about it, which is interesting. It's one of the things I want to follow up in my research on him. But this is a guy who has kind of a can-do attitude, right? He wants to go out, he wants to meet the challenge, and he wants to overcome it. And I think a lot of that is not just Nisbet being a Westerner, being from California, but it's also having studied with Taggart and looking at the West as an opportunity more than as a degradation.
Interesting. Yes, I think there's so many layers that if you think about today, just even some of the debates, like, and
everything from those, Michael. This is fascinating.
Well, and also even just like in politics, which is like, I mean, and I don't follow politics that closely, compared to many people, but just even like, just think of, say, Trump's language. Everything's terrific. It's amazing, incredible. We're going to make everything's going to be great. And then there's a kind of a sense, both Republicans and Democrats, like, no, it's over. We got to manage it. I think you see this. There's a line from Peter Thiel. He said, they promised us flying cars and all we got was 140 characters. Which
is really clever.
Super clever. And I think it's this kind of tension between like, what are we going to do? Are we just going to kind of further create more consumer goods and propaganda, or are we going to actually do something that is transformative?
Well, and Michael, tension. This is all over science fiction. Think about Bradbury and Martian Chronicles. This is the whole essence of the story, right? Are we going to make something on Mars, or are we just going to ruin it like we've ruined everything else, right? There's a lot to that, I think, and that's the zeitgeist as well for people like Kirk and Nisbet. This is the era they're growing up in, too.
Yeah, super interesting. Well, okay, let's keep moving on, but that's fascinating. I mean, we could do a whole other think about this. Super. Okay, so there's other sets of influences, and that you talk about, of course, that Nisbet talks about. Is he says, I thought it was interesting. He started reading the 19th century counter French revolutionaries, right? They were against the French Revolution. But the thing that's amazing to me, I always thought when he said, "To my shame or embarrassment or eternal regret," or something to that effect, he said, "I didn't read Tocqueville until I'd finished my doctorate."
Isn't that amazing?
And Tocqueville becomes super influential in him. So maybe, why don't you talk about, in addition to Taggart, what about these 19th century, you've talked a little bit about some of them, and Tocqueville, could you kind of explain those things? Because I think that helps develop also when you read Quest for Community, all these names are coming up, right? Lacordaire, Lamennais.
Right.
You already mentioned Proudhon. I'm not sure how to say it either. But maybe talk a little bit about that whole set of influence, because I think this is something I'd heard a little bit about it beforehand, but I think it was probably through reading Nisbet, I don't know, like 10 years ago or something, that like, who are all these guys? And maybe talk a little bit about those guys.
Yeah, so, that's interesting because you look at someone like de Tocqueville, and de Tocqueville, of course, in terms of his own philosophy and his religion and his view on the world, is a deeply conservative, anti-revolutionary view. But then his politics would have been pretty much commensurate with, say, Ron Paul today. And that, I think there's a lot in the way that Nisbet views the world as well. Right? His current politics are kind of libertarian, but his view of the world is deeply conservative in the way that he looks at the past. De Tocqueville, of course, comes out of that tradition because his family had nearly been wiped out by the French Revolution. He comes out of that tradition where he's at least friendly to the Roman Catholic Church, even when he's not practicing. He's friendly to the aristocracy, even though he's not convinced that he's a part of them, but he does come from at least an upper middle class, kind of lower upper class family. And again, had almost been wiped out by the French Revolution. And there are a whole school of people who come out of in French historical thought that are not a part of our Anglo-Saxon tradition, but who had a really insightful look at what was happening in France and were really on the ground because they saw what the revolution did to France. They're now in that generation after France, after the French Revolution, and they're seeing what it did. That, I think, that's one part of the story, Michael, that I think is really important, that de Tocqueville is that Nisbet is trying to tell, that there is a counter-revolutionary school, a reactionary school that's very healthy, that is very interesting and is worth looking at. But the other part of that story is just look at Nisbet's personal life. As you just said, and you said it so well, Michael, here we have a completely de Tocquevillian dissertation and view of the world without de Tocqueville being an explicit part of it, right? That's amazing that Nisbet could write his dissertation and that he could come up with all of this that is so de Tocquevillian, but without de Tocqueville actually being explicit in his own scholarship. And this is where I actually, just from a historical standpoint, I think no matter what, we always have to credit Kirk and Nisbet with something very important. And that is, whereas Kirk is probably the most important voice bringing Burke back into the common language, and especially in the post-war world, in the Cold War, we have Nisbet is the most important voice bringing back de Tocqueville. And to this day, even if we were at a place like Michigan State or the fairly liberal college, there's still going to be courses taught on Burke and de Tocqueville somewhere. They may not be as explicit as they were 30 years ago, but people are going to take those figures somewhat seriously, even if they dismiss them. And that's part of that revival that comes out of the conservative revival of the 1950s, that we take these guys, de Tocqueville and Burke, so seriously, in large part because when we think about what is America, we don't want to just say we're not communists. Right, that which I think was a kind of a trend. We're not Nazis and we're not communists. Well, then what are we? And I think that's part of what Burke and Nisbet are both trying to answer in those critical years right after World War II. What do we actually stand for? And that's why they're both friendly to the American founding as well, because we're not just against something. We actually do believe that America stands for something. And for Nisbet, that meant we stand for associations, and we believe in the plurality of associations.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think that's very interesting. I mean, I think it was shocking when you think, Tocqueville, everybody reads Tocqueville. And here's Nisbet, a Berkeley in the 30s.
Who is
no one was reading Tocqueville. He said nobody.
Yeah. And both Burke and Tocqueville are out of fashion from about 1900 up until about 1945. So, we go 45 years, the books aren't even in print. Right? It's not until I think 1938 that Alfred Knopf comes up with a new edition, if I remember right. I may have that date wrong, but I think it's 38 that they decide to publish de Tocqueville again. And that's stunning. I want to throw this in right now too, because I don't want to forget this. Michael, have you seen the new book from Luke Sheehan, Why Associations Matter?
No, I haven't.
I don't think it's out yet. I think I've got a review copy. It's from the University Press of Kansas. I just got it maybe 2 weeks ago, but it is definitely a book that you're going to need, and a book anybody at Acton would want. So it's awesome. A history of associations and a political theory of associations, all based on Nisbet.
Oh, great. Okay, good. No, I'll get it.
Luke's a great guy. I don't know if you know him. He's at Duquesne in Pennsylvania. Really great guy.
Oh, fantastic.
Young
good.
Guy, he's probably 39, 40, but a real up-and-coming scholar. This book's already important, so definitely.
That's fantastic.
Why associations matter.
No, I will. Thank you. That's great. Thanks for that. And I think that's actually maybe a good time to turn to go through maybe some of the key Nisbet ideas, right? So in before he comes upon Tocqueville, he does know, he sees the kind of this, and correct me if you think this is not right, but he sees that the problems that we're facing, not just Roosevelt, et cetera, come from a specific thinker that he calls the demon of the modern mind.
Oh, yeah.
And that is Rousseau. And Rousseau is really, he thinks, is the source of modern totalitarianism. And he, for Rousseau, this is the way I articulate it, and maybe you can explain it better. But Rousseau identifies community, so we're questing for community, right? Rousseau identifies community with the political community. And for Rousseau, all the attachments of family, church, region, regional dialect, civil associations, the mutual aid societies. All of these are obstacles to individual emancipation. And so they have to be pushed off. And then what you have is the individual, but the individual has to be somewhere. He has to be embedded in something. And so he's embedded in the general will and ultimately this Leviathan state. And Nisbet says this is the fundamental problem with this is basically the theory that leads to totalitarianism, both of, say, a fascist or communist kind, or soft despotism that Tocqueville later calls of a democratic state. Do you think is that right? And then maybe you could elaborate on that.
Well, you said it beautifully, Michael, and I probably just end up repeating what you just said because you said it so well. But yeah, this, and it's one of those things. It is funny. I don't want to knock Nisbet on this because you're never going to read an objective study on Rousseau from Nisbet. And I'm no fan of Rousseau either, but conservatives do tend to do this. We love to have our boogeymen, right? So you get someone like Vogelin who just hates Joachim de Flores.
Right. And he hates him. Yeah, I have actually friends who kind of like Rousseau. Some of the Straussians who like Rousseau, they're like, no, Nisbet's, it's too much. There's more going on in Rousseau than this.
But so Joppites, they hate Wilson. And agree, I hate Wilson too. They're just, but we always have these boogeymen. For Kirk, it was Machiavelli, and there is something almost laughable at times when I read Nisbet on Rousseau because he just hates the guy so much that you think, okay, he can't be quite that bad, but he is. That's the interesting thing. He really is really bad.
Well, can I say, before you do this, can I ask a question? I want to talk about, don't you think there's one positive overlap in a sense between, I don't like Rousseau either. I've a lot of problems, but there's his discourse on arts and sciences, right? In one sense, is kind of a conservative reaction against techno-utopianism and progress that aligns with Nisbet. Right. I mean, you could say, granted all the complexity of Rousseau, but there's something in the discourse on arts and sciences that, look, just because we have technological progress doesn't mean we have moral progress. And what Rousseau wanted is very different from what Nisbet wanted. But that there's a little bit of an overlap and an alliance there. Do you think that's correct or not?
I think that's totally fair. I think that's totally fair, Michael. But you think about, There's something too in the early part. Okay, so let's think about Rousseau for a moment, right? If you're trying to find fault, and it's say 1935 or 1940, and you're trying to figure out where did these Nazis come from, where did the communists come from, and for someone like Nisbet, who's been influenced by Knock, especially during the late 1930s, he's going to try and think of those forms of collectivism as the same, right? Which, and I agree with. I think Nazism and communism are flip sides of the same coin. I would guess you do too. I mean, Father Sirico does. There's a long history of those of us not on the left who look at that as similarities. And so he does as well. And so he's not interested in playing the game of, is it the Nazis or is it the commies, right? They're all bad. And he wants to figure out what can we say here? So do you do the kind of typical argument in 1940 that, well, we'll blame Nietzsche for the Nazis and we'll blame Marx for the communists. And he says, well, no, let's go further than that. And that's where I think Nisbet is genius on this. And he's taking this from Irving Babbitt as well. Irving Babbitt absolutely hated Rousseau, and reading him on Rousseau is almost identical to reading Nisbet on Rousseau. So they hate Rousseau. And what's interesting about Rousseau is, unlike Marx and unlike Nietzsche, Rousseau never got his hands dirty. So one of the things he did when he abandoned his parents, but you can't actually say, oh, he's responsible for the mass death of millions of people in the way that Marx or Nietzsche. You could at least make an argument that there's something there. Rousseau, part of the reason that we can say, oh, isn't there a good side to him, is because he was vague on certain things. And that's exactly what Nisbet hates about him, is that he was vague when it came to things that really mattered. Right. He just allowed us to kind of decide where he's going with it. And so in that sense, yeah, I think Rousseau is deadly because we're never going to associate him with the Holocaust or with the Gulag. And that's part of what Nisbet is so frustrated about. He's like, come on, we've got to find out this guy is really bad and we've got to pin something to him. But he's hard to pin anything to because he is and he was so vague. And again, the only thing we really have is, look, the guy was, excuse my language, he was an SOB because he left his wife and his kids to the state and took off. And that's horrible. I mean, it's absolutely horrible, but it's not killing 6 million people in the Holocaust camps, right? So I think that's part of the frustration on Nisbet's part, was that Rousseau can't be nailed down that way. But if we think about him philosophically too, one of the things that Nisbet thought Rousseau was so good at, which means he's not good, right? He's evil about this, but he's good at, is he finds a way to mix the totalitarianism of Thomas Hobbes with the libertarianism of John Locke. And Michael, I've heard you argue this before. I don't think anyone in the modern conservative movement argues this as well as you do. You argue very effectively that individualism is a detriment to not personalism, but individualism is a detriment to freedom. And that's something I think, as you have taught me, that's something that I think a lot of modern libertarians get very wrong.
Well, thanks for saying that. I mean, I think that's the great insight from Tocqueville for me, and I think from Nisbet.
Right.
That individualism, this is like such a Tocquevillian insight, right? That individualism leads to centralization.
Exactly.
And I think this is where, if I understand this right with Rousseau, is that that Rousseau, because he wants in a sense to emancipate man from, how do you do that? Well, it's kind of a nominalist radical idea of freedom, right? That freedom is merely the exercise of your will.
Yes.
And if we think about like Marxian notions of freedom, right? Hunt in the afternoon, to do litter, critter after dinner. That whole, the whole
I
line
never
there.
Understood how anyone could be attracted to that, but whatever.
Roger Scruton, the late Roger Scruton, may he rest in peace, has this fantastic line where he says about that. He's like, "Who's going to provide the literature for you to critique? Who's going to provide who's going to milk the cows?" It's just really like a very practical, like there's all these layers of things that you're just not paying attention to, which is the problem of ideologue. But this kind of notion of freedom, I think that's dominant today, right? It's dominant in kind of like a Silicon Valley and at the edges of like transhumanism, like radical autonomy. We see it, this idea that we're completely free to do whatever we want. And that the way we get free, and I think this is where I think Nisbet's so insightful, is this Rousseauian idea that all these attachments are obstacles to our freedoms. We have to be emancipated. But if you just have one little emancipated individual, that individual, you can't run a political order like that. So that means there's only one authority. And like we talked about, I give this example sometimes, thinking about, so like I'm married, my wife could leave me, right? Decide what she wants to do. I mean, no one would blame her, but but she decides to leave me. Who could stop her?
But for the grace of God, right?
Yeah, but for the amen. But who could stop her? Could the church? So I'm a Catholic. We were married in the church, but the church has no authority to stop her.
Right.
Could her family stop her? Could I stop her? Could our children stop her? No one can stop her. There's only one institution that can stop her, and that's the state.
Right.
So in one sense, the state's the only authority. Well, if the state's the only authority, there's some benefits. And this is why I actually like Nisbet, because he takes seriously the fact that sometimes regional, local, and familial attachments can be oppressive.
Of course.
Right.
Of course.
So like the example I give is like, if you're an African-American in the 40s or the 50s and you're being oppressed by a local redneck community, you want the state to help you.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. And I think Nisbet takes that seriously. That's why I think he's so valuable, because he's in attention. He's not just romantic about civil associations, but that you have this individual, and this is the Tocquevillian insight, that individualism leads to centralization, and that the state wants individuals because the state can control individuals in a way they cannot control associations.
Exactly.
And I think this is where this is actually, you kind of brought this up, so we'll just follow it. This is actually where I'm skeptical of libertarians. That's why I think libertarianism is a problem. I'm a very limited state guy, as you know. But I think the problem is if we don't take seriously associations and various forms of authority, then we end up creating this little tiny individual under this massive Leviathan state, and there's absolutely no way to resist it.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you, Michael. And I would call myself a kind of Tom Woods libertarian. Maybe like Nisbet. I mean, I think conservatism explains the past very, very, very well. But I am also extremely limited government, to the point where I'm a little sympathetic to some of the guys in the late 19th century that Nisbet likes as well, despite the nastiness that goes along with the word anarchism. I want civil society to flourish as much as possible. Yeah. But you bring up the great example of race. I mean, what a critical moment where obviously you do have to have intervention at a higher level. And there you've got the nation state acting morally. Absolutely. So that's a critical. Hey, I want to just, if you don't mind, I think about the way that Burke talked about Rousseau, right? The idea that he says that with Rousseau, we basically get metaphysically, we are each individually naked and shivering in front of the community. Right. And I think there's something to that. We're stripped, right? We're stripped of our associations with Rousseau. We're stripped of our marriage. We're stripped of our race. We're stripped of our ethnicity. We're stripped of our religion. We're stripped of our education. We're stripped of our neighborhood, right? We come to each other purely as equal individuals, but we're not really persons at that point. And that, I think, is a critical moment. And so if you don't mind, Michael, I just want to read one of my favorite parts of Reflections on the Revolution in France. If anyone's out there and wants to follow along, this is on page 307 of the Liberty Fund.
Well, and can I say, too, that this is the Moral Imagination podcast? And
yes, I know. I was going to read from that, something a little bit farther than that in the book, right? So this is page 307 of that. But I love how Burke puts this. He says, "We begin our public affections in our families. No cold relation is a zealous citizen. We pass on to our neighborhoods and our habitual provincial connections. There are inns and resting places, such divisions of our country as have been formed by habit and not by sudden jerk of authority. We're so many little images." I love that. The little images, right? The little words as opposed to the word. The little images of the great country in which the heart found something which it could fill. The love to the whole is not extinguished by the subordinate partiality. I love that. I think Burke there gives us everything that conservatism really stands for. It's at its best right at that moment.
Yeah, I think that's it's very powerful too that we're shivering in front of the community.
Yeah,
I really like how you
right.
Yeah, but you actually make a really important point that there's an important difference between being a person or personalism and an individual, and I think that's what some of the personalists, like of course John Paul Wojtyła and others, I think add to this. There's another you have in your essay on Leviathan Inc. You said that something I think you quote Nisbet where he says, "Both strains come together in the social contract and make of that a work, a manifesto, which served with equal adequacy on the libertarian principles of 89 and the authoritarian principles of 93. You're talking about the beginning and the end of the revolution.
That's Nisbet, right?
And Nisbet says, "This affinity between social individualism and political power is, I believe, the most fateful fact of the 18th and 19th centuries.
Right.
It forms the very substance of the ideology of the political community." And I'm going to repeat that part because the ideology of the political community. And it wraps itself in the language of morality and virtue. And then you write, "To fight the state in Rousseau's understanding is the same as fighting the good, that's true, and the beautiful, because the state, as such, becomes nothing but a secular true church."
Yes. Yeah,
and I think
super.
But I think that's the connection, don't you think, is that what happens is and this is why I think conservatives and libertarians especially need to read Nisbet, because I think sometimes we keep talking about the importance of the individual, as opposed to the collective. But I think that's a false dichotomy. It's really the question of embedded individuals in a multitude of plural civilizations. Plural associations. This is very Nisbet, right? That is that which we need to juxtapose with the state. And so the individual and the state are one side, and then the person embedded in lots of associations seems to be the other.
Yes.
Do you think that? I mean, that seems to me
absolutely
the great Nisbet insight, which is, of course, Tocqueville and Burke.
I don't remember where this is exactly in Quest for Community, but he makes a statement at some point, and I love the way he put this, that what we really need is a plurality of private spheres. Mm-hmm. And I thought, oh, yeah, that was just really well put. I like that. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, so I think one of the things, I'm trying to look at a note here, that Nisbet talks about two kinds of ways of thinking about community. And then he talks about monism versus pluralism.
Right.
So monism is this unitary vision of the state, the political community of Rousseau and Bentham. And pluralism is social diversity and various levels of authority. And I think that's that distinction, right?
Yes.
So, okay, so let me ask you, I want to ask two things. One, I want to just make sure we kind of finish this little Rousseau-Tocqueville thing, because we're having a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But I want to make sure it's clear.
Jean Jacques.
But so Nisbet's response then, which we already kind of articulated, but just to kind of summarize, his response would be, in response to the radical individual, what we need is the embedded individual in a plurality of associations. Right. And so the real
person.
So we have to have in a sense, it's a personalism, and what he asked for a new laissez-faire, a laissez-faire of a plurality of all these different kind of associations. And it seems to me, I think, if there's something that we need right now to make Nisbet very relevant to now, is we need to think about how to rebuild associations in the midst of individualism and increasing state power. What do you think?
I agree. And not only do I agree, I wonder how, so if community is that powerful, if we acknowledge that Nisbet's right on this, that this is a fundamental human drive that would create community, I wonder if one thing that we haven't focused on, and I don't mean you and me, Michael, I just mean overall conservatives in particular, and especially since Reagan. Reagan was really in favor of small groups. And you can see it in his speeches where he talked about Rotary clubs and Kiwanis and all of these things that mattered. But I wonder if maybe we're not giving, that is the conservative movement today, we're not giving enough credit to varied communities. I mean, we look around, and even though right now with the coronavirus, we're seeing a fairly similar response by a number of states, we've also got some varied outlooks, right? We've got the Dakotas that are kind of refusing to go along with some of these lockdowns. And we've got other places where basically in Texas, we've got the governor saying, look, worship is an essential service. And therefore, I mean, we are seeing some diversity, and we are seeing a reaction at the local level in some ways. So I don't think, when we talk about someone like Putnam saying we're bowling alone, I don't know if that's gone. I look even at a place like Hillsdale, where we're already a weird little, lovely, but a weird, eccentric little community. Even within Hillsdale, we've got all kinds of little groups in Hillsdale. We've got sororities and fraternities that are very active and very healthy, frankly. They're not the crazy fraternities of other places. We have groups like, there's a group on campus called A Few Good Men, that they just go around and they help the elderly and the disadvantaged and cut down trees and take care of siding on houses. And, and it's just, I see my students just do this naturally, where they form these little groups and they go off and do things. So I don't think it's gone. I think we're at a situation where we've got people at the national level just screaming at one another. And of course, they're doing everything in their power to capture the levers of power. But there's still a lot going on in local communities that has not disappeared by any means.
So I totally agree with you. I think let me say two things, and feel free to push back if you don't agree. One is, I think I agree with the first part. I do want to say, I think there needs probably to be a bit of a deregulation of what I mean by that. And generally, that's more of like a theme, to allow for more and more individual, unique solutions to things.
Yes.
Through communities.
Yes.
And I think sometimes there's just, there's obstacles. And so this goes to Tocqueville, right? When he talks about in Soft Despotism, in it's book 4, volume 2, book 4, chapter 6, I think, or 5 or 6, but 6, I think, where he says, is the Soft Despotism, where he says that you have this law, all these layers, right? He said, so you have this, I imagine a multitude of men circling around themselves, seeking after the banal and vulgar pleasures with which they glut their souls. And above them stands the state, right? And there's all these layers of things that enervate. So Tocqueville talks about in his section on soft despotism, how you get all these rules that enervate people. It doesn't really push them down. It just stops them from acting. And so I think in a sense, we need to have a deregulation to allow associations to flourish. And also maybe thinking of technology. Don't just think of technology as a individual liberator, but what if it becomes a community liberator, a social liberator? And I think this is, and some things are happening, but I think maybe more of that. And then the other thing is, though, but I do agree with you, there's a lot of things going on. And I remember, think of homeschooling, for example.
Oh, absolutely.
And people think of, people who don't homeschool at all, and we partially homeschool, people think, oh, homeschooling means you just, it means basically what's going on right now with the coronavirus. Everybody's isolated. But that's not what happens. There's all these groups and activities and things going on. And so I think you're right. And I think one of the things we have to be really careful about is to say, oh, everything's bad and I'm just kind of a grumpy fellow here and, nothing goes wrong and the whole world is messed up. And instead, what we need to also be thinking is, well, golly, we actually have a lot of opportunity here to accomplish things, and we should do it. So I think some of it is sometimes we kind of overstate the theoretical element. I also want to say that's related to that, but that I do think that there's what I don't know if this is a good way. Maybe you're a wordsmith, so you'll come up. But I call it sometimes like a sociological snobbery. Like the sociologist thinks, oh, those people, they don't know what's going on. Well, actually, a lot of people are doing a lot of things, and there's a lot of things going on. And just because you don't necessarily, sociologists, see it when you hang out with your colleagues and you kind of look down on people because you're not actually engaged in their lives, it doesn't mean that there's not things going on. But at the same time, I think there needs to be more. And I think, unfortunately, I would argue that a lot of the welfare state, a lot of the large state that had, some of it was well-intended, but it ended up basically crowding out civil associations. And so while I don't think necessarily people are bowling alone, I do think, it seems, at least from the data, that especially people in the poor, the lower kind of economic echelons, they don't have the civil associations that are needed, and we need more of those. We need to build those, and I think, but I do think still in America we can have plurality, and so I think part of our job is to actually not just talk about it, but actually build these things.
I agree. I think that's excellent. I think you stated it beautifully. And you're probably right. There's probably a bit of a middle-class bias in what I said, because I think most of the associations that we do see are middle-class associations, and probably the extremes, those at the upper crust, in the upper crust, and those in the very lower probably do not have access to that as much, which is unfortunate, because we think about in the 19th century, it was exactly the lower classes and the lower middle classes that benefited so much from associationalism. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I think it probably is a very middle class thing.
So let's there's so much we could talk about, and I know I don't want to take up too much more of your time, and I know you have to go. But let me.
Fantastic talking, Michael.
Oh, I really appreciate it. I hope I hope I can have you back.
Before you move on really quickly,
yeah,
I also
sure.
want to point out, when in Tocqueville, since you were quoting from him in chapter 5 of volume 2, on his famous chapter on what we do in civil associations, remember he makes that, after he says how natural it is that we associate, he says, though, that one of the things that happens to us is that when we don't associate, we actually lose the ability to even think about associating. So as he says, this is in the Liberty Fund edition of volume 2, page 900, the more it puts itself in the place of associations, meaning the government, the more individuals lose the idea of associating and will need to come to their aid. So there's that vicious cycle that once the government becomes involved, at that point, we lose the ability to even think for ourselves that we could take care of a problem like homelessness or drug abuse or alcoholism. Mm-hmm. We turn it over to someone else. And that, I think, is a really important insight onto Tocqueville's part.
No, I agree with you. And I think we look, for example, just immediately like, oh, well, shouldn't the state do something? Shouldn't the state solve this? And I actually think this is why I think Nisbet's so important, right? Maybe one of the main reasons is that Before I read Nisbet, I'd say, oh, well, why are we looking to the state? But I didn't realize that this is why Nisbet identifies Rousseau, is that there's an idea. This goes back to your developmentalism. There's an idea, and the idea is that the community equals the political community. And so it's a confusion about what the community is. And so this is why the principle of subsidiarity is so important.
Yes.
And even people get confused on, they think subsidiarity and solidarity are opposing principles, but in fact, it's solidarity, that is love of neighbor, that gets manifested in subsidiarity, which is that closest to those people close to the problem handle it. And and this is, I think, a Tocquevillian insight too, when you handle it, it actually grows your solidarity. And so it becomes a virtuous cycle. And I think the key insight from Nisbet is to say, not just should the state do it or not, or the individual. The question is, what's a community? And are there different kinds of community?
Yeah, absolutely.
So what I want to do before we end is push on something. So we've talked about how neither of us really like the state and everything. And I'm quite a committed supporter of free competitive market economies. I'm for many reasons. One of them is because I think they're really important for families. I think they're important for political and religious liberty. I think when an economy gets highly regulated, it gets captured by the rich and the well-connected and powerful interest groups.
Sure.
And so I know, and we've talked about this, and I've given lectures at Acton about this, there are negative effects, cultural effects of a market economy. So I'm not a utopian when it comes to markets. I think that markets have to be subsumed in a moral order, and it's a very complex question. But I am a supporter of market economies. And Nisbet points out, and it was a challenge to me, but I've been thinking about this a while. I don't know what you think. And I think he's right, that there became an alliance in Manchester liberalism between the individualist elements of capitalism and the state. And that some of the people who we agree with on a number of things are very skeptical of markets. People who even read Belloc, who's very influential, and Robert Nisbet. And I disagree with them for lots of reasons, which I'm happy to talk about. One of them is it always seems that the ideas of regulating the economy is that capture takes place. And I don't think that, say, what you call like kind of Belloc critics of the market take seriously enough the fact, like, who's going to set the prices?
Right.
Who's going to determine how much somebody gets paid? How are we going to stop it from becoming crony managerial capitalism? Okay. And of course, we have that now already, right? So that one of the response would be like, we already have that, right?
Yeah.
But I also think there's something in Nisbet that challenges the free marketer that says, wait a minute, how do we create an economy that's free and competitive, but that doesn't aid and abet the totalitarian state, or forget the totalitarian state, doesn't aid and abet crony capitalism or just kind of the encroaching state. I mean, and I think this is a problem too with technology. I think a lot of Silicon Valley, the individualism there aids and abets a growing Rousseauian state, okay, and what Tocqueville calls soft despotism. So what would you say to that? If I support free markets, I think you do too. I'm not sure exactly where you stand, but what would you say to that critique? Like, Nisbet's worried, and I think maybe as a free marketer, I didn't take seriously enough the fact that free market individualism can actually exacerbate the problem of soft despotism.
Yeah, that's a great question, Michael, and I'm not sure I have a great answer for it. I will say that Nisbet does state repeatedly that the only way that one can have an effective free market is if there is the social structure of family and community that exists. He argues repeatedly that a free market is one of many associations, but it has to be a powerful association equal to the other associations. So in the same way that we might get involved in the sphere of religion or the sphere of politics or the sphere of education, we also have the sphere of economics. And he wants them to be kind of all competitive spheres as he sees it. So yeah, I agree with you. I think he can be very, very critical of the Manchesterian school and the idea that you can just have any market at all. And in large part, though, it's because he worries about what morality will come out of that. And he wants that morality to come from local community. But he also, towards the end of his life, especially in the 1980s, he started writing some really interesting things that I still need to digest a little bit more. But he started writing about the meaning of genius. Have you had a chance to read any of his stuff on genius?
I don't think so. No.
Yeah, it's very, very good.
Yeah, sorry, are these essays or are they in a book?
Yeah,
in books?
Essays. He wrote a couple of essays in the American Scholar, and then they show up in his book on prejudices.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I have that. In fact, I have it here.
Yeah, he talks about, he's got one article just called Genius and another called Genius and Milieu. And in both of those, he tries to figure out what is the difference between a kind of utilitarian genius, which he would say Steve Jobs would be a kind of utilitarian genius, and an artistic genius or a cultural genius. And he does it's probably been a year or so since I've read him, Michael, and I would need to go back and look. But he does make the case that genius usually only runs for about 3 generations. So you'll have someone like a Michelangelo and then his child and his child. So the child and the grandchild, and you can kind of keep the morality and the genius going, and then it just kind of dies. And so he's interested in asking, why does this arise and why does it fall apart? But his answer is not surprising. His answer is essentially, you have to have a strong moral family structure. And if you don't have that, you're not going to have elements of genius. That genius arise out of that, not out of free competition, but out of morality. And that, I think it's interesting. And I'm not sure what I think of it, Michael, in terms of, I, Brad, agree with every aspect of it? I don't know. But I think there are questions that we have to wrestle with.
No, it's good. Yeah, I found one of them, and I'll read those. I think they're really important. I think it's interesting that you brought up the family because, he talks about the importance of the STEM family. Yes. As opposed to the small nuclear family and the kind of paterfamilias, and how in STEM families you create culture. And I think this is maybe too big for now, but I think it's another interesting element of how he thinks about the family is very innovative, but also traditionalist, like realizing that we have to make an effort, we have to make an actual effort to strengthen the family in a way that it becomes culturally a force.
That's right. It's not just automatic or a given.
Right. And especially in the culture we live in today. So we have to think about the family and sociologically. And again, this goes back kind of back what we were talking about this earlier. This is why I think Nisbet's interesting, because he doesn't just kind of have a moral element or a poetic element like the way Kirk does. He says, okay, that's great. Sociologically, what are you going to do? And I think he quotes Ortega y Gasset in the beginning of Quest for Community, where he says, if there's no function, the association falls apart. And I think that is, I know we have to end pretty soon, so maybe we can end kind of around this and say, one of the things that also Nisbet brings out that's very practical is that all the associations from the family to the mutual aid societies to the different kinds of groups to education to schools, they have to have a function for them to continue. And the problem is, if they're just kind of like amalgamations for convenience,
right,
then it's not enough. And this goes, I think, to maybe we can end here, this deep insight of Nisbet on the importance of authority, and that there must be multiple kinds of authority as opposed to simply power of the state. And could you elaborate just a little bit on Nisbet's understanding of authority?
Yeah, he in his one of his best books called The Question of Authority that he publishes in 1975, he juxtaposes, and of course he's coming out of Watergate, and he felt very betrayed by Nixon and very betrayed by what was going on within the conservative movement at the time. So there's a personal element in it, but he's also considering, Vietnam, the decline of the economy and the oil wars, and what's happening with Watergate. So he talks quite a bit about the distinction between authority and power. Power is that thing which is forced upon us, whereas authority is that thing that we freely abide by. And usually when there's authority, it's authority that is given. So my mother has authority over me, not just because she's my mother, but because she's done something morally worthy as a mother. That's authority versus power. So when I was a little kid, obviously she had power over me because of where she stood. But if I went along with what she said without having to be threatened, it was because she had authority. And that, I think, is what Nisbet is worried about, is that the modern nation state, whether it's democratic or communist, that both of them have become too reliant upon the idea of power, that they can simply decree, right? Remember Burke, right after that passage on the moral imagination, he makes that statement that their laws are governed only by their terrors. And that's exactly what Nisbet is trying to fight. When we go out into the community, it's probably worthwhile that we think, it really would be stupid if I ran this four-way stop sign. I really should stop and look. And that's an element of authority where we say, look, the local community was right in making a four-way stop here. And we actually abide by that, not simply because there's a stop sign and because we're worried that there might be a hidden camera that'll give us a ticket, but because we recognize it's the right thing. That's the kind of thing that Nisbet is very concerned with, that we don't lose that old common law tradition of the law is real because it emerged from us.
Right. I'm just the two things like Lord Acton says, liberty is the delicate fruit of a mature civilization. And that requires not just maturity on the citizen, but also a maturity on the legislators. They also have to be mature. There's a great story that Father Robert Sirico tells that we actually made a little video of it at the Acton. I directed it. It was really fun because he tells a story growing up playing stickball in Brooklyn. And so we did this period piece, which was fun because we had about 35 actors setting up a Brooklyn street, and it was really fun to direct that, and I learned a lot. And I got a megaphone, which was awesome because it's great to have a megaphone. But
Michael with a megaphone, no.
It was the best. Anyway, but actually, so you can. It's coming out soon at Acton, it'll be at Acton, The Good Society, and I'll put a link up to that. But actually, he tells a story amidst learning stickball lessons that there was he always tells this story, and you might have even heard him tell it before, about a lady in the neighborhood, Mrs. Rabinowitz, who had no power but authority. And if any of the children kind of did anything wrong, she would say, okay, that's it. Knock it off. I'll tell your mother, and whatever it might be. And they would obey. And so we actually, in this little video, we kind of take Father Robert, he's telling all the stories of growing up, and we did a little period piece on that. But I think it's really important. I think it's a very powerful story that Mrs. Rabinowitz didn't have a gun. She was in the police. She didn't have any, but she had authority. And if people got out of hand, she could bring order to the neighborhood. And this goes to the kind of the point you're making about the stop sign. There's agreement. There's moral authority that goes on. And I think that's an important element with Nisbet. Well, Brad, listen, I've taken tons of your time. We could talk a lot more. I hope you come back to talk more about Nisbet, but also about Kirk and Dawson. I think we should. I mean, Dawson is a huge, very important thinker. So thank you. So why don't we end really quickly? What would you say that, I'll ask you a couple of speed questions. If you're going to start with Nisbet, what are the best two things to start with to give us an introduction to Nisbet, do you think?
Oh, definitely Quest for Community. Definitely is the place to start. And then I think I gave you the wrong title. The authority book, I can't remember. It's
Twilight of Authority.
Twilight Authority. That I would say second. And maybe if you're really political, if you've got an audience member out there who just loves politics, they might want to start with The Present Age. That would be good too. So any of those are good.
And I'll put up.
Don't start with like the sociological tradition.
That's great. I really like that, but it is, it's not. It's more of kind of like a summary. But no, I definitely agree. Quest for Community is just a wonderful book, and there's so much going on in it. It's such an exciting book. And then now your essay, can we get a hold of that? Is that published yet? Leviathan Inc.?
Yeah, actually, it's in the Political Science Reviewer, but I think it's also posted at the Imaginative Conservative, so you should be able to find it.
Okay, and then links for you. Okay, links for you, the Imaginative Conservative, also Hillsdale,
that's
and then
name. theimaginative.org, and then I have a personal website, spiritofcecilia.com, that I do a lot of more of my Christian humanist stuff. So
and then you have like Stormfield. What's that? Another one too, right?
Storm! I haven't done as much with that. I kind of went to the Spirit of Cecilia, but Stormfields. I still kind of cross post there, but most of my new stuff is at spiritofcecilia.com.
Okay, and then finally, I asked Jim Otteson this question. So, I said, Jim, what's one of the most important books in your life that shaped you? And he said it was the Iliad. So what about you?
that would be, I would the first thing, and probably because we've been talking about it, but I would say Reflections on the Revolution in France. I have read that repeatedly throughout my life, along with The Lord of the Rings. Those would be like the two great books for me that I keep going back to all the time.
Perfect. All right, good. Brad, thank you very much for joining. Thanks for your
my pleasure.
time. Super fun.
Absolutely my pleasure. And let me know when you want to talk again.
Okay, thanks, Brad.